Hello and good evening and welcome to the very important edition today of the Business and Banking Dialogue show. Today, ladies and gentlemen, with your support and patronage, we are today on the 99th show of the Business and Banking Dialogue. To me, 99 is of great importance. If you like cricket, there are far less number of people on 99 than people who are on the 100th. Okay, century is something that everybody looks to make, but to be on 99 is a privilege, and it's a very also a moment of a lot of anxiousness. So 99 is extremely important. We are on the cusp of a big milestone, and hopefully everything going well, we will be completing our 100th episode on the coming Monday, the 14th of September. So on that 99th show, we have a new speaker for you. Okay, we try to get you new speakers, new topics, new subjects, such that the information flow that comes to you on a day-to-day basis from the Business and Banking Dialogue remains, and it's fruitful to you. So today we are going to talk about protecting banking with forensics. Okay, protecting banking with forensics. So to talk about banking with forensics, we have with us Mr. Samir Paranjpe. So please, ladies and gentlemen, do welcome Samir Paranjpe to the show. So just a brief about Samir. Samir leads the forensics practice for Grant Thornton, India. Samir brings along with him 20 years of consulting and industry experience, out of which more than 10 years has been in the forensic consulting and investigation space. Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, the forensic and consulting and investigation space is really getting a lot of traction. And these days, with something that's going on, you are able to see on a day-to-day basis, almost 24/7 on the television channels. Forensic investigation is a hot topic, something going on big time already. He specializes in carrying out large, complex investigations in diverse sectors such as financial services, media and telecom, manufacturing, automotive, across all industries. He is also a financial services sector specialist with experience across the different substreams of financial industry landscape, such as banking, insurance, capital markets, and private equity across India, the Americas, and the continental Europe. So there you have, right in front of you, his slide. All about him. Samir has completed did his commerce graduation. He has also completed a management development program from INSEAD, France, which is commendable. So let's begin our discussion. Samir. Samir, good evening and a warm welcome to the Business and Banking Dialogue show.
Good evening, KK, and thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this. I didn't know I was the 99th guest, so yes. So let's try and make the 99th special so that we can look forward to a well-deserved century next Monday.
Absolutely, the most 99 is the position where most people are so anxious, to get that just one run. So it's going to be very interesting to watch, to hear you. And this is a topic which is, which is really getting a lot of attention these days. And so we would like to know more about it. So in order to make the subject of forensics clear for our participants, with what is involved, with the work on different types of forensics that we hear on a day-to-day basis, and we hear almost every day on the channels these days. So let's demystify the subject of forensics as what we know on the forensic sciences, with the following quick questions that I would like to ask you. What is forensics audit, and how is it different from the regular audit?
Okay, so I think that's a great question. Good opening delivery, if I may say that, from cricketing parlance. So typically, KK and the viewers, forensic is a little bit of, I'll just sort of take a step back. Forensics is a little bit of a misnomer. What we essentially do as a part of my day-to-day role, is focus and help companies sort out any sort of misconduct. Now, misconduct can be in any domain. Misconduct could mean a procurement fraud, a fraud carried out by your administration. It could mean at a higher level, something that we saw in cases like Satyam and Enron. where there was massive diversion of funds. It could also mean misconduct in the personal domain, for example, sexual harassment complaints. We help companies sort that. The other part of forensics also deals, when we talk about misconduct, is misconduct with regards to regulations and laws. So in case there has been any infringement of regulations or laws, forensics gets involved. So that was just sort of explaining what we do. Forensic is a fairly fancy term. I just sort of wanted to demystify that. Now, forensic audit is a very banking specific terminology. Forensic audit is nothing but a forensic investigation mandated by lenders or investors into companies to which either they have lent or invested money, to try and identify what really happened with the money. The money that they have lent to a certain company, or private equity investors having lent to certain corporate, they want to understand what happened to the money. Was it used for the purpose for it was raised? If not, what happened to the money? There has been any sort of misconduct on the part of the management team of the company.
Okay, great. That's nice. Before I ask you the next question, Samir, a little bit louder if you can speak. I think it will be great.
Sure.
So what is then what is forensic accounting? What is forensic accounting?
Okay. Forensic accounting is essentially trying to identify, as I said in my previous response, trying to identify misconduct. Typically, if you're trying to identify misconduct, you would need some sort of evidence. The only hard evidence from a corporate investigation perspective is going to come from two aspects. One is a detailed review of the books of accounts of the company. So data, documentation, financial, operational records, to try and see if there has been any misconduct, malfeasance, diversion of funds, etc. The other part where there can be hardcore evidence is from the IT assets of the company. The laptop, desktop, personal computing systems used by individuals, as well as stuff like servers and that are used by the company to store data. So these are two sources of hardcore evidence that is used. Typically, more often than not, about in 70-75% of the cases, it does involve an exhaustive review of the financial and operational records. When I talk about financial and operational records, I'm talking about the accounting system, the SAPs, the Oracles, the tallies of the world, which we essentially try and look at to identify any discrepancy and then probably identify fraud. So that's forensic accounting deals essentially with that.
Okay. And you are with you are in the advisory position, right? So when somebody says, hey, give me an advisory, what is forensic advisory then?
Okay. So what we typically try and do, KK, in forensics is essentially answer 4 or 5 questions. Number one, so please understand that whenever companies call us, it is always in the aftermath of an event. By event, I mean there is a suspicion that something inappropriate may have happened in the company, or the company is reasonably sure, or our clients are reasonably sure that something wrong has happened. So whenever we are called in, we are essentially asked to answer 4 or 5 questions. What really happened? Is there a fraud, not a fraud? How did it happen? Who are the parties who are responsible? What are the potential damages that we are looking at in INR perspective? And what can be done to prevent it happening again in the future? So each and every one of our investigations involves responding to either all or some of these 5 questions.
Okay. And what would you say is a forensic investigation? Is it all about crime or something else?
So forensic investigation, as I said, we are typically called in case if there is a suspicion by our client that something inappropriate may have happened. So essentially, we are called in to see if the suspicion that they have or if the concerns that they have are well founded or not. So that's why typically we call it forensic investigation, because in using different tools and technologies, which we'll talk about later which we'll touch upon later in the program, we are trying to identify whether the concerns, the suspicions that the management has any merit or not.
Okay, great. So I know, at the common parlance, audit means it's all about numbers, right? Whether 1 + 1 adds to 2 is generally audit is all about that. Is forensic audit also all about numbers, or there is much more and beyond numbers in forensic audit?
Okay, that's a great question, KK. So I'll probably talk about audit the way typically it is understood. So typically when we talk about audit, there are essentially 2 kinds of audit from a regulatory perspective. One is statutory audit,
Yes.
in which firms like ourselves, what they are trying to do is trying to look at the books of accounts of the company to see if they give a true and fair picture. That's the purpose of a statutory audit. Then there is internal audit, which is where we are trying to look at whether the controls and risk management system of the company is robust, fit for purpose, and effective. So that is typically what is covered in an internal audit. Forensic audit is, as I said, is a little bit of a misnomer. For forensic investigation, forensic review is what we are trying to see is, as I said, the management has, there are typically two kinds of forensic reviews. One is what we called on the detective side, whereby post an event has happened, we are called in to investigate and answer those four or five questions that we talked about. We are also called in what we typically call as preventive, where companies, there is no fraud or there is no concern that has happened in the company. What the companies come back to us and tell us is, given our experience and expertise in combating fraud, can we sort of, let's say, look at the processes of the company and try and make them fraud proof basis our forensic investigation experience. So there's a lot of work that companies essentially give us trying to fraud proof their processes, controls, and risk management ecosystems.
Okay, great. So this is final. This just to set this.
Sure.
I'm asking all this just to set that we have audience from different bases coming. They are bankers, they are fintech people, they are regulators. Now let's take a case. Okay, let's say that example, say company X has reported a fraud, and it says, Samir, can you please come and investigate? So, and you go and you see that the accounts are, say, in SAP, accounting is in SAP, some are in Excel, some data is in Excel, some data is kept on cloud, branches are in some Excel, in some legacy systems and open systems, and all sorts of technologies are put into this. So you are like thrown into a place, into a customer who has got all sorts of things, and said, okay, now explain how you're told, okay, go ahead and investigate, do a forensic audit. So could you tell us how would you go about it, and to make it more complex, the owner is absconding, or the IT guy is absconding, and the data is deleted. How would you go about planning an entire forensic audit?
So KK, just one question. Did you happen to speak with any of our clients? Because it suspiciously looks very familiar to some of the cases that we do.
No. No, I just pulled it out.
Okay, that's
I just thought it.
Okay, that's scarily similar to a real life situation that we always typically encounter. So let's split it into two parts. One is what the financial and operational records are there. So you're saying that typically it's a mishmash of different systems, different legacies of different vintages. So you have the latest reasonably cutting edge SAP, you have good old Microsoft Excel, and perhaps you have other legacy homegrown systems. So typically what we tend to do is, as the cliche goes, there is nothing, and here I'm borrowing from the world of crime, there is nothing such as a perfect crime. As you know, the accounting system is typically based on a double entry principle. So if you pass an entry, you have to have a balancing entry somewhere else. So typically what we try and do is we collate data from all the three accounting systems. Given that it's essentially a mishmash of different accounting systems, it is not possible, if there is a fraud in the company, for the perpetrator to have covered his or her tracks. So assuming that he has, let's say, funneled money out of the company, at some point in each of these three systems, there will be a red flag that typically my team will try and identify. But as I said, it is not possible for it to be a completely seamless exercise. Once we have the red flag, then it's just a question of looking at that thread and sort of pulling it out to see where the trail leads. So from an accounting system, that's what we do. You said also this other part is data, which is stored typically on IT system. You said the IT person is absconding and you're not sure what sort of data is available. So in that typical scenario, what we try and do is we carry out a data, for want of a better word, a data holding exercise, whereby me and my technology team will land up at the company space with appropriate permissions. And whatever data they have, we'll carry out what is called as a digital evidence recovery exercise. A digital evidence recovery exercise allows you to copy data resident on any computer system, ranging from laptops, desktops, iPad, mobile phones, servers, anything, and make a copy in such a manner that it is made in a legally tenable manner. So if tomorrow that evidence is to be presented in a court of law, it is allowed as legal evidence, number one. The other benefit of a digital evidence recovery exercise is it allows you to retrieve deleted data. I'm assuming if somebody was essentially a flight risk, he or she would have deleted data before they sort of got on the plane to go wherever they wanted to. So as long as the machine has
Yeah.
not been formatted or the server has not been formatted or junk, any and every sort of deleted data can be retrieved. And as I said, the way it can be done is it's legally tenable. So if tomorrow the case were to go legal, you're in absolutely safe hands.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I think that kind of sets the perspective and why and how it is done, etc. So thank you, Samir, for a great explanation. Samir, most of the banks have implemented technologies to reduce the financial and perhaps the reputational risk posed due to frauds, money laundering, and cybersecurity breaches. Despite this, the number of banks' forensic engagement are steadily on the rise. What are the reasons?
Okay, that's I think another great question. So KK, typically, as you rightly said, financial services institutions, I'll not just talk about banks, financial services institutions are in the business of money. And obviously, as a result, they attract the greatest amount of attention from fraudsters and their ilk. As a result of that, typically all over the world, the most sophisticated fraud fighting mechanisms, both from a technology as well as skill set perspective, is with financial services institutions. Having said that, as you rightly said, in spite of that, there are, I mean, forensic accountants tend to be hugely in demand as far as financial services clients are concerned. And the reason is essentially twofold. One is human ingenuity. There is nothing on the world which can sort of be made human ingenuity proof. You've had multiple cases of hacks carried out at the most advanced software companies, which probably have the best brain. But there's always some smart human being somewhere on the planet who's willing to hack and penetrate those systems. Number one. Number two, what I always tell my clients is typically a fraud risk is a combination. If I had to give it as a mathematical formula, it is a combination of two things, which is opportunity into intent. All key stakeholders who might be on the call and all key stakeholders in the financial services world are trying to reduce the opportunity to the extent they can. Intent is something that nobody on this world except the Almighty can control. So if somebody has the right intent, human ingenuity, then probably he or she can easily penetrate the system. And that's the reason that people like me will continue to have a job.
Yeah, I think I think what you're doing is a very niche area, very specialized area, and so great to have you, ladies and gentlemen. I continue to have discussion with Samir Paranjpe, and this being a question, this being a topic of utmost interest, you may go ahead and ask questions right away, so that we don't have problems at the end of the show. We want to keep our respect our time, the guest timings. So you can go ahead and ask questions. You can ask also directly in case you wish to ask. So the one of the big problems that is bothering all of us, Samir, is the non-performing assets with the financial institutions. Typically, a lot of these public sector banks. Can forensic audit prevent the kind of the increase of NPAs in banks?
Okay, so KK, I think I'll
a little louder, Samir. A little bit louder, please.
Sure,
yeah.
Sure. So I'll give my answer in two parts. Phase one, typically, what we are called to do when we are called to investigate NPA cases is the banks give us a mandate to carry out a review of the books of accounts, financial and operational records of the borrower to try and identify, as I said, if there has been potential diversion of siphoning of funds. The monies that they had lent to the borrower, was it used for the purpose for which it was given? In the event there are adverse findings, obviously then the path for the banks is clear that number one, there will be no restructuring that will be of that particular NPA account. And then depending on the severity of the case and the decision taken and the advice provided by the legal counsel, they can go the legal route against that particular borrower. As far as forensic audit, so this is currently in the current scenario, this is more of a detective control, as I would say. Once there is a concern, once an account has become an NPA, then typically the forensic accountants are called in to try and identify if there has been some misconduct. The question that you are asking would typically involve, and which is where we help a significant part of our clients, is carry out what we call rigorous monitoring of key accounts on a regular basis. So in the event we see that a particular account is in the danger of falling into the NPA bucket or undergo amount of stress, corrective actions can be taken then and there itself, rather than sort of waiting for it to turn in NPA. There are two different sort of solutions that we're
Yeah.
talking.
So we can kind of, you're saying that you can give early alerts, right?
Yes, yes.
Early warning alerts is possible
yes.
for forensic audit. Great. Okay.
Yes.
I think I already got some. Okay. So like I said, the audience does ask questions. So I have a question directly coming to you, and it's coming to you all the way from London. Okay. So good morning, Mr. Kaza. The present day corporate fraudsters require mathematical savants like in the movie The Accountant to find forensically money laundering funds diversion where funds move over interlinked companies. While a lot has been said, except in the case of Obrecht in Brazil, there is no known case of a successful forensic audit leading to prosecution and convictions. You have any comments, Samir, on that?
So I think that's a great question. So my response to that is, I think as forensic accountants, we can essentially do the job.
Samir, Samir, before you go ahead, the mic, can you just take it up a little up, your mic?
Sure. Is that better?
Yeah. Okay. This is better. Absolutely better. Yeah.
Perfect. So I'll just hold it that way. So I think in response to that question, I think our job is to essentially identify instances of diversion of funds, siphoning of funds based on details available to us. Our end point is that we carry out our work, we prepare a report and hand it out to our client. Post that, then for any legal action to be taken is in the domain of the client and then the regulatory authorities, over which unfortunately we have no control. So many a time we have seen that we have given instances which contain fairly adverse and strong findings. But honestly, in the way wheels of justice work not just in our country but in the world over, then essentially somewhere it sort of just tends to get sidetracked, and probably the results are not achieved as one would like.
Okay. Yeah. So, but I think it's fairly new, so it takes a little bit of time. Any kind of this takes to become a proper convictions and all that to happen. So, but great questions from Mr. Kaza. Thank you, Mr. Kaza. That was a great opener. So let's look at some of the technologies and tools that are used, Samir. So, what are the different tools and technologies and techniques used to identify a fraud?
Sure. So essentially, KK, what we in forensics do is we have essentially 4 key pillars that any investigation includes. One is what we call as data and documentation review, which is, as I said, a thorough review of the books of accounts, financial and operational records of the company or the target in question. Second, a very, very important field is what we call as forensic data analytics. Nowadays, you see that every company, even smaller companies, have a reasonably strong IT system in place, even though it might be a homegrown application. So companies themselves are sitting on huge amounts of data. The sad part is that if somebody were to look at the data, you'll probably 80% of the frauds can be identified before they assume serious proportions. So a lot of our work involves forensic data analytics, whereby we churn through millions of terabytes of data and try and identify the one key red flag which will allow us to investigate. The third part is what I already talked about, digital evidence recovery exercise, where we can carry out a digital evidence recovery on any sort of electronic assets of the suspect. And last but not the fourth one is what we call as market intelligence. And this is a very India specific solution to an India problem. In India, our data systems are still evolving. So a lot of information, lot of key inputs come to us from the field. So typically, I have in my team people who are former police officers, people from the intelligence bureau, people from the intelligence agencies. What they do is they bring their linkages and connects in the field to give us qualitative information. For example, which person has a connection with whom? Is there a political angle involved? Who potentially has Benami assets, where he or she has stashed his money, which becomes very, very critical in an investigation in India. And last but not the least is what we typically call as open questioning. And this
Yeah.
happens in cases which involve employee misconduct. So once we have conducted our investigation, we have what we call as circumstantial evidence, not the silver bullet, which will help us close the case. Then we have an open discussion with that particular suspect in the presence of the legal, HR, and key representatives of the company, whereby he or she is confronted with the evidence that we have and their explanations are sought. Many a times, looking at the sheer volume of data, the the person concerned or the suspect concerned tends to confess his or her involvement, and we are able to close the case. What we also do there is we also have certain psychologists on board who participate with us in those open discussions to try and identify, saying, oh, this suspect is still stalling, he or she is now about to confess, you might not get anything out of this, what is the angle that we should of the questioning should be. So fairly sort of these are essentially the 5 pillars that we tend to use in any forensic investigation.
Okay, that's nice. So another query from Mr. Pushpinder Khandelwal. He says, in banks, forensics is for KYC, vendors, retail loans, and it is sensitive for banks also because forensics directly deal with data, which may lead for litigation also, and it also involves reputation risk for banks. My question is whether forensic audit will eliminate 100% fraud of banks. I doubt it. When staff and customers both are involved in a fraud, how can forensics protect the banks?
Okay. So there are two questions. One, I don't think there is any solution in this world to eliminate 100% of any problem on this planet.
Absolutely.
So
Yes.
what we can try and do is follow what is called the Pareto principle. Focus on the 20% of the problems, which will at least solve 80% of the issues.
Yes.
To the second part of the question, I think he also talked about confidentiality. I think my entire business is based on confidentiality. So obviously we have strict confidentiality covenants in place. We are absolutely mindful of the fact that in any forensic investigation, our clients tend to give us extremely sensitive data, and we are extremely mindful of that. And we ensure that appropriate safeguards and controls are in place in my team when we take an investigation. The third part is what typically in forensic parlance is called as collusion, where the customer
Yes.
and the vendor, or the custom vendor and one of the employee of the bank is involved. And yes,
Yes.
in typically what is the most common investigation typically we do is procurement fraud, because procurement is a horizontal across all sorts of industries, not just financial services. And 95% of procurement fraud always involves a collusion between an insider and an outsider. And we have a high degree of success rate in able to sort of ensure trying to identify the linkage, and being able to sort of come up with the desired results. So to answer the question, yes, we are fairly confident of investigating cases which involve collusion.
Okay, that's great. I hope Mr. Khandelwal, you got the answers for you. Dear viewers, the poll is in progress, so you will want to share your answers to the poll. Also, like I said, if you want to ask a question directly to Samir, you could do that. Okay, raise your hand, and the digital team will enable you to ask the question directly to him. To answer or not, of course, is the prerogative of our guest. So you could also do that. So Samir, can you tell us how banks can be benefited due to the forensic audits of companies which are under the insolvency and the bankruptcy code IBC resolution?
Sure. So KK, as a part of the IBC code 2016, there is something called as a transaction audit, which is already written into the code. So for every case that goes into insolvency, there is a transaction audit that has to be done before resolution is done. Now, transaction audit typically is undertaken by the forensic teams of professional services firms like ours. What transaction audit looks at is essentially 3 or 4 elements. One, were there any preferential transactions? So during the 2 years prior to the code, were there any preferential transactions undertaken whereby preference was given to a particular set of creditors over other? Were there any undervalued transactions whereby whereby the company may have sold assets or given away goods at a price to a particular entity at a price which is lesser than the market price? And one of the other elements that we typically look at is extortionate transactions. So if tomorrow, let's say the promoter of a particular company under insolvency, the company has taken premises on rent which belong to the promoter, and the rent is 5 times is typically what the rents in that area go for. So these are called as extortionate. And last but not the least is called as fraudulent transactions, which are fraudulent to the creditors of the company, whereby we look at transactions which with related parties and a whole host of things that can be classified as fraudulent transactions. And the IBC code makes a provision that once these transactions have been identified, depending on the ruling of the NCLT, which is the judicial authority, there can actually be a clawback. Money can be disgorged from the entities who have been found to have indulged in such transactions. So typically the previous owners or previous management of this of the company under insolvency. So the code makes provision for that. So that's what we typically do in a transaction audit under IBC.
Okay. It's to be. Also, the fraud landscape, Samir, is changing dramatically, I think, and that's bound to happen with more and more digitization. There are always going to be challenges in data protection. So, what do you see as emerging trends in combating fraud moving forward?
Okay. I think that's a fantastic question, and perhaps I or any forensic professional can talk about it for 2 days, but I'll try and keep the answer brief. Answer brief. So typically, as KK yourself identified, there are multiple, I mean, the whole world is getting digitized, for want of a better word. Everything is at a click of button. What it does is every button that we click opens up another touch point for potential fraudsters to essentially take advantage of. So clearly, the more digital we go, the more convenient it gets, but at the same time, the more riskier it gets. And there are multiple sort of examples of that. So clearly, cyber frauds, hacking, phishing, ransomware, there's a whole host of things that can be done, which essentially will only increase as the world becomes digitized. Secondly, in the COVID times that we stay in, one unintended consequence of work from home is obviously, as you rightly said, data security. Or there are companies, corporates, professionals who are working from home. They may not have access to a robust data protection or an IT system or a firewall that typically works in a corporate environment. And clearly, that obviously leads to its own set of risks for fraudsters to take advantage of. The third trend that we are seeing, and this is again COVID related, is a lot of data theft issues. So typically, in order to keep the lights on, companies have essentially transferred data, critical confidential data, which can only be accessed, typically used to be only accessed from company premises, from company desktops. Employees have been given access to that. There have been multiple cases where employees are downloading data, selling it to competition, quitting the company, taking the customer data, going to competition. So we have seen a spurt in such investigations in the last few months. So those are the 3-4 trends that we can look at. Additionally, again, a function of COVID is that obviously the economy numbers are out for everybody to see. Obviously, there's currently a lot of corporates are under extreme stress, and it is not expected that the stress will ease anytime soon. So clearly, as the cliche goes, that in times of low tide, more and more such events come to the fore. So we should be braced for an increase in such incidents, maybe sometime next year.
Okay. Samir, let's take a question from one of the participants. We have a very experienced banker, Harish.
Sure.
Harish, Harish Prabhu, can you unmute and ask the question?
Sure. Good evening, Samir. Presumably, any corporate or banking fraud entails connivance as the core strategy to execute the fraud, right? How can and does preventive forensics address this issue, if at all, including throwing up early warning signs, red flags? This is one question. The second is, it's more to do with how has preventive forensics evolved as a practice for firms like yours to provide insight to PE investors, other investors, into the founders prior to the consummation of the investment? Because at the end of the day, I have been in certain situations whereby forensics, after having signed the term sheet, and the problem was that the founder was a doctor and he had actually kept behind a lot of information in the US, which essentially blew up. The deal blew up purely because he did not disclose information, and only preventive forensics actually, was able to, find that out.
Sure, sure. So I think those are fantastic questions, Harish, and good evening. Thank you so much for the questions. I'll first answer question number one. In terms of preventive forensics, as I'd said early in my program, and I'll sort of pardon me for repeating it. Typically, fraud risk is, if I had to give it as a mathematical formula, is opportunity into intent. Intent is something nobody on this planet can control. What you and I, as key stakeholders in the anti-fraud landscape, are trying to do is trying to reduce the opportunity to the extent possible. So what preventive forensics tends to do is reduce the opportunity for a fraudster to create the fraud, to sort of do the fraud. So when we talk about preventive forensics, what we do is essentially try and, let's take an example, look at your processes from an end to end, try and identify typically the fraud gaps and make them fraud proof. So if somebody has to genuinely sort of desires to do a fraud, then he or she will need to at least display extreme ingenuity to sort of go around the controls. So that's something that we are looking at. In terms of how the market has sort of been looking at it, I think it has been on an increasing trend. But honestly, I've been in forensics for 12 years. India still continues to be a reactive market. Close to 70% of my bread and butter comes from investigations, which means I only get called in after the horse has bolted, if I may dare say, and then I'm asked to investigate. We are steadily, it will take some time, but we will sort of get up the proactive ladder. In terms of your second question on P, I think that's a great question. So typically we work a lot, and a lot with private equity funds. And there are sort of two sort of things that we do, right? As you said, before consummation of a deal, we carry out what is called as corporate intelligence checks on the promoters or background of a particular entity. These would involve essentially two kinds of procedures. One would be a detailed public domain check on the promoters, on the entity, on the key management personnel of the target, to try and identify if there is any adverse news bit anywhere in the public domain. So we essentially look at is there any negative news about him in the media? Is there any legal case? Is there something that I mean, just a red flag that any PE firm needs to be worried about? Secondly, what we tend to do is typically, once you have sort of selected one target, any private equity fund will carry out a financial due diligence. So what we do is we have a comprehensive offering whereby 2 or 3 members of my team of the forensics team will go as a part of the financial due diligence team, because the moment I say forensic, the promoter or the target is not going to open his or her door for me. So we typically go as members of financial due diligence team. And whilst the financial due diligence team looks at as an asset from a FDD or a transactions perspective, my team looks at it from a forensic perspective and tries and identify if there are reasons to be worried about. At the end of that exercise, our clients typically get 2 reports. One is the FDD report, and one is a forensic review or a forensic opinion on what we think of the asset. So that's typically, and we have unfortunately seen multiple cases whereby the deal did not go through because as a part of our forensic due diligence, we essentially identified certain stuff which was totally inappropriate, and the PE fund decided to withdraw from the deal.
Yeah. KK, if you allow me to indulge one more question, which is extremely important. Everybody knows in the banking world about the Gleason fraud. I mean, one individual brought down an entire bank, which is maybe 100, 200 years old, which is Barings, right?
Yes.
And this was primarily because he was actually the front office guy and the back office guy, and he used to put the trades, right?
Yes.
And on hindsight, probably the whole thing, blew up, right? So
right.
How has forensics evolved? And this, I think, is now 10, 12, 15 years. I don't know how many years.
Yes.
Has forensics evolved in order, because of digitization, etc., and all, to prevent such frauds, completely or even partly?
So Harish, my response to that would be that, and as you rightly said, Nick Gleason is a great example. Honestly, there was no segregation of duties. He was the guy who used to make the front trades and then used to punch it in the back office, and then hallelujah, everything used to be fine. Honestly, you would expect that that typically companies in the ecosystem would have evolved and would have robust controls to take care of such instances. And the fact that, as I said to KK, probably the fact that I have a job means that honestly it has not evolved to the extent it should. So typically, as I said, when we sort of land up at any place to do an investigation, the first step that we do is understand the organization structure and the roles and responsibilities. So if we were to land up in a similar situation like Gleason, we'll clearly see step one is this is the guy who's doing front office and mid office and back office, and you essentially know which is the area where you should focus your investigation energies on. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but
Yeah.
Well, anyway, thanks a lot. Thank you.
Samir, if you may permit, I would say that the Gleason case or even the PNB fraud case, these are all, I don't think it's a forensic issue. It's a breakdown of processes and checks
absolutely.
and balances on the system. Audits, typically audits. I mean, where were the auditors who, what did they do when they knew that Gleason was himself entering the trade and he himself was authorizing it? I mean, this is
Absolutely.
clearly that has got nothing to do with forensic. Okay, it's clearly a process failure out there, and somebody has overlooked that the process, although they knew about it, and that's why it kind of collapsed. Okay, so thanks for that, Harish. Good question, and good question on the PE fund. I like that question from you. Thank you very much. Samir, while I wait for the next question from the audience, forensic accounting is a robust and tough discipline. Okay, and now with this WFH that is coming in, and everyone is working from home, what kind of challenges do you face during, when if you're audit, what kind of problems do you see in this kind of in the new normal that is coming?
No, I think that's a fantastic question, KK. You hit the nail on the head. Typically, as I explained, a significant part of me and my team's time is spent on looking, reviewing, digging up financial and operational records of the company. In the new normal work from home environment, we are totally dependent on our clients being totally technologically sophisticated to be able to give us all the data that we require online. Unfortunately, 50% of our clients are not. So that does involve, so essentially means that we essentially need to rely on hard copy records. We need to operate out of the company premises, and in order to be able to sort of continue to do our job. And that has been essentially the challenge. So in fact, my teams, after taking adequate protocol, have been working out of client premises since June, July. And as you know, Mumbai continued to be on the lockdown, significant lockdown longer than the others. So obviously, from a logistics perspective, that was a significant challenge, and not to mention the health and safety of my team. So given the job I do, that does tend to be a challenge, but we are essentially trying to look at what workarounds we can do.
Oh, well, these days we did talk to Kushru about virtual audit, if I'm not mistaken. And he said that we do audits without. I mean, it's forced, of course. If he has done audits without going down to the customer side. Is that something you can also? Is that something which is possible even with forensic, that you can get things done remotely, or that is just not possible?
No, it can be. As I said, KK, it depends on how technologically sophisticated our target or client is. So, for example, if P investors have asked us to sort of look at one of their portfolio companies, if the portfolio company has the ability to sort of share data with us in an online virtual environment, then obviously my job becomes easier. But even then, assuming a perfect case scenario where that particular company is 70% or is 100% technologically savvy, even then in my case it will be 70% is the max that I can hope to do offline. I will need access to hard copy records and other significant documentation that will only be available in a company's premises. So 30% will still involve going to the company's premises and finishing the job.
Okay. Do you also look at in forensic accounting that purely the technology, that is the data part of it, or you also look at what are the kind of processes they are following?
Sorry, I didn't understand the question.
Do you also look at the kind of processes that the company is following, such that you feel that if the processes are not there, it can have a breakdown, or you don't look at that?
Oh, absolutely. So as I said, so typically step number one in the example that you gave right at the beginning, the fact that if there are disparate accounting systems with different legacies, so you have this for A and B, or this particular unit maintained in Tally, some other unit maintained in SAP, somewhere it's on Excel. That's the first biggest red flag as forensic accountant, because that is not something that potentially, and when forensics tends to make you cynical, having spent 12 years there, I'm extremely cynical. So uh, so
Mhm.
that essentially tends to the only inference that you can draw is this is something, either this is if such a scenario were to exist, so either this is extreme ineptitude or this is something done by design, and more often than not, unfortunately, it seems to be by design.
Okay. So, Samir, fraud is always hidden, right? I mean, it's never, it's always undercover. So, what are the different tools and techniques used to identify a fraud?
So, KK, as I said, those are the earlier 4 or 5 areas where 4 or 5 techniques that we tend to use. There are many
Yes.
instances, for example, where in case of a P investor or a bank, the target or the company or the borrower becomes hostile. They absolutely refuse to entertain
Yeah.
us, not share data, not give any updates. Even then, there is significant material available in the public domain, because if they are if it is a if it is a me- if it is a small size, medium sized company, they would be required to file returns. They would be required to file returns with the ROC. So there's significant part of material available with the Ministry of Corporate Affairs website, ROC. There's a charge document there. I talked about in the question with Harish that we do an exhaustive public domain check to try and identify if there are any red flags with regards to the promoters or the executive management of that particular entity. In more often than not, at least in case of banks, banks do have access to the bank account statements of that particular target. So using these 3-4 areas, and last but not the least, what I said, market intelligence, whereby former cops, former people from the ED, DRI, try and give you human source intelligence to try and identify and make those linkages. So using these different elements, what we try to do is we try to weave together a picture that seems to emerge, and we are still able to sort of try and meet the expectations of our clients, even in instances where the targets are hostile.
Okay. Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's about 8 to 9 minutes to the hour, and I would request you to kind of if you have any questions, this is the time. Okay, don't wait for the last minute, because then it becomes very difficult to get the questions across. We have to respect the guest time. Uh, so, in the event that access to financial and operational records of a target you are investigating is not available. We did speak about it, but typically in cases where forensic advisors are appointed by lenders or investors to do a forensic review of the financial and operational records in the portfolio, what could you do? I mean, we did talk of an example, but is there anything else left out in that? You could consider
So,
option.
so as I said, focus. So essentially, in there, the focus is on two parts. One is you have to continuously try and engage with the target, even though they might be hostile, because by engaging with the target, mailing them, trying to send them meetings, trying to have meetings with them, essentially what you're doing is you're creating an audit trail for your client. So if tomorrow the client wants to go legal against that particular target, you have created an audit trail saying, in spite of multiple attempts and in spite of the PE agreement or the lenders agreement in place, which gave a right of audit to the bank or to the PE fund, the target was not cooperating. So one is sort of from a procedure protocol perspective, we have to continue to keep our efforts on. And secondly, as I said, after typically 1 or 2 or 3 meetings, mail exchanges, one tends to get a view that whether there is going to be any sort of cooperation from the target or not. In the event that we envisage that there is going to be no cooperation from the target, we try to do is, as I said, an exhaustive public domain search to see what's available in the public domain, an exhaustive search of the relevant regulatory websites to try and glean whatever information we can, a detailed discussion with our clients. So if it is a PE fund, they typically would have had access to MIS that was shared with them from time to time, and other updates that the company, being a portfolio company, would have shared with them. Or if it is a bank, they would have access to bank account statements, stock statements that, as a part of their regular procedures, the bank would have mandated. So we try and collect all of it, and as I said, we try and put it all together to see what is the story emerging. And more often than not, we are able to sort of give adequate indicators to our clients. The only thing that needs to be mentioned is, given that we have had zero access to the books and records of the company. In most cases, our findings, even though they are of an adversarial nature, will tend to be circumstantial in nature. It will not be a slam dunk or a silver bullet which will serve as evidence to sort of take them in a, I mean, to prosecute them in a legal manner.
Okay. Devendra asked a question. What is the, do we get FIRs filed for any of the investigation that you have done? What's the kind of percentage that? And second question he has is, because forensic, these kind of investigations are new and anyway, for digital frauds itself are new, and the law enforcement does not have that kind of training in investigation. What are the success of getting a police complaint and in a conviction happening in these places?
Okay. So in fact, Devendra, two things. One, as I said earlier, our job is to investigate, prepare a report, and then our report is with the company. So typically, if the company or our client decides to take a view that they would want to go legal, then our report can be the basis for filing an FIR. Secondly, what companies tend to do is if it is an instance of an employee misconduct, then essentially it's a cost benefit call that the company takes. That is it. I mean, is it worth everybody's time to go the legal process, or can that be solved by discussions with the particular suspect? Thirdly, as I said, we have. I mean, for obvious reasons, I can't. Though some of the cases that we are doing are covered in the public domain, we are currently working with multiple regulatory agencies on extremely high-profile mandates. If you just sort of Google Grant Thornton Forensics, you'll probably get an idea. So in most of these cases, we are working very closely with the EOWs, SFIO, EDs of the world, CBIs of the world. And where they lean on us is essentially for forensic accounting support. Because from a legal perspective, they do have the requisite skills in place. But accounting, looking at data or documentation and building a coherent case is something that they typically lack in. And that's where they sort of lean on us to from a accounting perspective. To your question about technology, again, similar sort of experience. As far as detailed technology procedures are concerned, law enforcement agencies do typically have reasonably decent technology labs. So for example, there is a forensic technology lab in Kalina of the Mumbai Police, which does work. But in case of specific instances, they do lean on firms like myself, firms like ours to sort of support them in particular investigations.
Okay. That's good to hear. Another question that comes across is that, is the forensic investigation admissible in the court of law?
So I think, as I had said, that's a great question. So what our reports are so all forensic reports are fact-finding in nature. So for example, no forensic report will give an opinion, take a position, or anything of that sort. We state facts. And because we state facts, they are typically relied upon by not only regulatory authorities, but judicial authorities as well to hand out verdicts or do convictions. So forensic reports, assuming they have followed the right protocols and are robust enough, can form the basis for legal convictions.
Okay, that's great. So you know, to kind of come to a closure on this session, because we're almost nearing 7. Tell us some of the key fraud trends in the forensic spaces currently and going forward. What do you see are the trends that you see?
Okay, so broadly, I think the way I'll answer this question is as follows. I tend to get asked that in the last decade, from 2010 onwards, 2007 onwards, there are, as you pointed out in the opening remarks, there are a large amount of frauds that are coming out. So does that mean that India is an extraordinarily unethical country, or are we looking down in a black pit with no end in sight? And my response to that is as follows. And I'll give a cricketing analogy. We had the IPL is just about to start, and we had the match fixing scandal sometime back in IPL. If we were to take sports as an indicator of where the nation is from a progress perspective, do read about the Black Sox scandal of 2019 in baseball. There was a famous baseball champion team called White Sox, which were from Chicago. They were banned in 1919
Yeah.
for taking bribes, and they were called as black socks. So right
Okay.
now, when we talk about the Western world and we talk about America having a fairly robust judicial system, I think every country needs to go through that curve. We are slightly behind in that curve, but I think it's just a matter of time in our journey as we move from emerging to emerged. That's a curve that all of us need to take. All the developed countries in the world have gone through that curve, and this is just as a part of that curve. And sooner or later, we'll come at the other side a completely ethical nation. So I think it just a curve that each and every country on this planet goes
through. Okay, that's nice. Good to hear. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to end this session today. But you have heard about forensics from Samir, forensic audit, forensic investigation, forensic accounting. There are various terminologies, and he's given you his perspective, and that he's been in this business for long. But this is an emerging area, okay? Because forensic investigation is an emerging area, and there's a lot of opportunity, typically for the fintech companies to be in this space. Because as the world, and in India, if you look at the digital push is extremely high. Okay, we want everything digitized, right? That's what we've been hearing from many of the subject matter experts also. The more we digitize, there will always be the other side of the coin, which always looks negatively and sees how can I do a fraud, which can be undetected, and that's where this science is going to emerge in the days to come. It's emerging, so the convictions are not there, but it will happen. There's a lot of FIRs and other things being filed, but because it's an emerging field, there are not enough professionals who can take it ahead. And Samir is one exceptional person who has the knowledge, who has the education, who has the depth, and so we kind of rely on people like him to take it across to us. So with these words, I would like to close today's session. Please, participants, first of all, a big thank you to all of you for watching us for the last 99 sessions. Today was the 99th session with Samir, and Samir has actually scored a century, scored a sixer, and so he is like crossed the 99. The anxious moment is over, so he's in the league of hundreds, that I could say. And we are, Samir, please join us on Monday. Do watch us on our 100th episode. We will be delighted to see you also there in the audience and ask questions if required. So if you want to watch any of our old participants, if you want to watch any of our, there is a link available. Go into the EPS website and you will find a business and banking dialogue, and you'll be able to see all of that, and also what is coming on Monday on the 100th session. Will also be, you'll be able to see very good speakers coming up your way. So what do we have for you on Monday, the 100th session of Business and Banking Dialogue? On this occasion, the very first time, we are getting 6 bright banking minds of this country together to discuss and share their insights on a very, very hot topic, the new umbrella entity, okay? The parallels or the complementary or supplementary, we can say, of NPCI. Okay, so we are looking at whether what's that all about, and the RBI has announced that. So what's it all about? How dissect it and understand what is the new umbrella entity. You can see the speakers we are bringing to you on Monday, and so and a great moderator too. So look forward to seeing you on the 100th session on Monday. Today, please join me in thanking Samir and wishing him good evening. And thank you very much, Samir, for spending your time, 1 hour and some minutes. Thank you very much for coming. It was absolutely wonderful talking to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Keke. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure, and all the best for your number 100 on Monday. And I'll be a part of it.
Thank you very much. Sure. Yes, absolutely. Thank you. We'll be delighted to have you. Thank you. Thank you, participants. Good evening and have a great day, whatever is left of it. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.